Welcome to this special episode. Let's start with Alex. Alex, you have coined the term camel approach company as a counter concept to the widely recognized unicorn. So tell us more about the distinction between these two.
Yeah, happily. And maybe I'll take a step back, even before talking about Camel, but like why I wrote the book and where it kind of contextually fits in. I'm a Silicon Valley venture capitalist that invests globally. I teach entrepreneurship, and in both those contexts, I was really frustrated that everything we knew about Silicon Valley best practice was rooted in a time and a place, and for a very particular type of asset-light, software-based company that wants to grow extraordinarily fast. And yet, outside Silicon Valley, in many ecosystems, the context just looks different. There might be less capital, less corporates that are ready to buy companies, less exited founders that are doing angel investments or mentorship or whatever. In short, a very different ecosystem. And outside of Silicon Valley, I actually believe the way to scale and build a business looks different. And often the best entrepreneurs in Abu Dhabi or Singapore or Lagos or Sao Paulo, where I just came from, have more in common with each other than they do with those in Silicon Valley. And so with that, the camel concept is this notion that in Silicon Valley we're obsessed with blitzscaling and growing extraordinarily fast. And unit economics might not matter and burn might not matter. Things have changed a little bit, thankfully, now. I believe that outside Silicon Valley, the best entrepreneurs build camels, build startups that are built on a foundation of unit economics, manage burn, a long-term outlook, which works in a context with less capital, but also more macroeconomic shocks and things like that. The book came out in 2020, and it's amazing how much this has become much more mainstream. So we could dive in a little bit more on that, but that's kind of how I thought about the camel and where it came from.
Yes, and we are in a region we value camels traditionally, so it's the right place to advocate for this concept. Also, in your book, actually, you advocate against merely replicating Silicon Valley model, saying that every region has its specialty. So tell us more, why do you think we should not copy Silicon Valley ecosystem?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot to learn from the Silicon Valley ecosystem, and I think equally there's a lot to learn from a variety of other ecosystems around the world. And I think the reason not to copy it is not necessarily, it's not, I would say, not a black and white, like don't copy or do copy. I think it's take inspiration, but then also take inspiration from other places. And so as I think about Abu Dhabi, for instance, I would say there's actually some really interesting things that are evolving here as a regional hub with ADGM, with obviously Hub 71. And there might be some lessons to share and learn from places like Singapore that are also equally becoming a regional hub for Southeast Asia. And so that's really the meta point of where I'm coming from, is that actually by taking the lessons of the best entrepreneurs and ecosystem builders in other regions, they can often be much more directly applicable today rather than hope. I actually hate, by the one of my pet peeves, I actually hate the explosion of Silicon Valley for X, like Silicon Savannah, Silicon X, Y, Z. I actually just think we should call places Abu Dhabi or whatever. But I actually just really think we need to think about what are the local strengths that can make something flourish, and that's where we build on.
Also, you mentioned about how many cities where 1 billion companies were born, and now they are increasingly larger than 10 years before. Can you tell more about this evolvement of a camel or unicorn companies where cities were the hub of those companies to be born?
Yeah, it's a little bit of an astounding statistic. In 2013, guess how many cities had created a unicorn? No, I won't make you answer. 4. Last year it was 150. So true explosion of innovation outside Silicon Valley, and it's a little bit of a runaway freight train. And about 20 of those cities, there's been 5, 6, 10 or more of these. So not just one unicorn, but actually a repeated process of minting really big companies. And I think we're going to see more and more the cycle. We did a study on this, and it turns out that if you look at unicorn production, like in China, for instance, it would have been one year, and then 5 years later there was another, and then a couple years later, and then at some point there's critical mass. And the year after that, which is about 5, and then it was 20 the year after that, and then 40. This similar kind of explosion that happens at a certain point of critical mass has been replicating in virtually every ecosystem. In Sao Paulo, where I was last week, we're seeing it. I believe we're going to see this here very soon as well. So I'm terrifically excited.
In your book, and also sometimes in your journey as an investor, you talked and you studied different jurisdictions like Brazil, Lagos, India, even you studied North Korea. So talk about some lessons you have learned about the specialty of each region, and what is common, what surprised you?
Oh man, well this is a big question. Maybe why don't I take like one tactical example of something that I'm seeing outside of Silicon Valley, which is this notion of having to build multi-market from the get-go, which I think is very relevant to the UAE. I think in Silicon Valley, the default is build your company in America, put all your people, with a YC letter, like come to Silicon Valley, build your team there. I think the reality is, if you look at the biggest unicorns that have come out outside of the Valley, but around the world, often it's born global from the get-go, and that has to do with how they build their products and their operations. It has to do with how they build their teams. My favorite example of this, and I'll take a non-UAE example, is the case of UiPath. UiPath is the largest business in robotic process automation anywhere on the planet. It was born in a small city in Romania, Iași. At the time, there were 2 companies in this category, one in the Valley and one in Iași. And when I interviewed Daniel Dines, the founder of this business, he talked a lot about how at every step of the way, because his local market was smaller, he had to build a product, a culture, an organization, an operation that could scale across markets very, very quickly. And that muscle ended up meaning that he was able to sell to enterprise clients much earlier and much faster, and then scale. And so ultimately, the small business from Romania ended up being the one that raised the most venture, won the market, and actually out-innovated the competitor. I think that's something that I'm seeing in markets that are comparable in the GCC, where the local TAM might be smaller, but actually there are service very strong launching points. And it's something I'm seeing the best founders internalize in their operations much earlier, is an operation, a culture, a team that can go across borders strongly. So that's one observation as I think about kind of the GCC.
Yeah, you just mentioned that every startup should aim global from the get-go. How do you balance between this and your argument? You also mentioned in your book that every startup should solve local problems.
Yeah.
So how I should solve my local problems and aim global at the same time?
Yeah, and if I took a step back, I think the book is a lot about trade-offs. If you are in Silicon Valley, you've got a massive local market, it's very easy to stay local and just target one country. If you're in a much smaller market, you have, by definition, the necessity to go global. And so kind of the trade-off that exists really depends on, it's hard to have one universal rule on this, but it depends on your business, your customer, and the size of your market. My observation is that there are massive markets, you put America in it, India, Brazil, where you could build a single country unicorn in a lot of different type of products. And then there's some much smaller markets, and Israel, Singapore, I think, I'd put UAE, right, are very good examples of that, where you actually have to be very quickly internationalized. And then there's kind of the in-betweens of, think of France or Mexico or whatever, where there's a little bit of it kind of depends on the business line and what exactly you're doing and what your TAM. But so there's no one-size-fits-all story. I actually would say it's born international. It's like this muscle of being international, and how international kind of depends on what you as a founder want to do and what behooves you as a business.
Great. You also, I mean, maybe something relevant here, you also challenge the Silicon Valley mantra of disruption. You said in your book that entrepreneurs should be creators, not disruptors. Tell us more. Why do you think this should be the case outside of Silicon Valley?
Oh man, everyone in Silicon Valley is obsessed with disruption. We're either disrupting or being disrupted. And I actually think language really matters, because using that language frames up the way we approach a problem. We look for a problem where there's an established incumbent with a old school technology, old school culture, and that's what we're trying to do with kind of a new approach and a new attitude. And I think that outside Silicon Valley, I really have observed the best founders saying, what are actually big gaps that exist in the market? What are massive problems that are unsolved? That were unsolved actually not because people were dumb or unable to do it, it's because the technology at the time didn't allow it. And today we have a bunch of these platform shifts that are allowing, it might have been mobile a couple years ago, it might be AI today. They're allowing us to solve problems that were historically intractable at much lower cost and much more accessible ways. And so when I think about this attitude of creation, I'm thinking about it as a way to approach the problems you choose to spend your time on. And when the book came out, we did a little bit of an analysis, and we just compared kind of extremes. We're like Silicon Valley to kind of the most kind of developing markets that we were looking at. And we said, if we were going to categorize the biggest companies, would they be disruptors or creators? And so when we looked at Silicon Valley, it was like under sub 20% doing things that felt in the creating of markets category, and most of them felt in the disruption bucket. But then when I looked at kind of the most developing markets in Africa, it was more like 80%, literally the opposite. And it was doing financial inclusion and health inclusion and digital inclusion, but things like that were core tenets of the economy. And I think that's ultimately, I think where you find the biggest opportunities long term, and where I would encourage founders in the room to think about.
So, for example, in some cases where some entrepreneurs just copy a model like ride-hailing or fintech startup from the US and apply it here and there, what do you call it? Is it disruption, creation here? What kind of startup innovation here?
It's so interesting because in many ways the same business model. I'll even take a step back. One of my favorite quotes of all time is by the futurist William Gibson. He once said, "The future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed." I actually think some of the biggest problems that are getting solved are taking some of the global ideas that come from elsewhere, and the biggest exit in the Middle East so far is Careem, which sold Uber and obviously inspired itself from actually not even Uber, but Sidecar and some of the apps that came before. One of the things that I think is terrifically exciting today is that we're seeing the best ideas come from anywhere and scale everywhere. So in the investments I'm looking at on the professional side, I've been spending a lot of time studying models that are coming from India, B2B marketplaces, that are solving construction and industrial, et cetera, that are now getting replicated in the emerging world. I was an early investor in a company called Chime Bank, which has become the leading neobank in North America. The first unicorn round in a neobank was in the UK. The second, I think, was also in Europe. The third was Nubank in Brazil, and it eventually came to America as a scaled business. And so I think we're actually now seeing more and more of these kind of ideas that are popping from everywhere, and I think that's going to accelerate as the statistic I shared a second ago, 150 cities created unicorns. We're going to see more and more of this.
So let's continue disrupting Silicon Valley mantras. You have also an opinion about blitzscaling and scalability. You argue for balanced growth. Tell us more about this, and why do you think rapid scaling might pose sustainability challenges for companies?
It's interesting. I think blitzscaling has a set of applications. Chris J. and Reid Hoffman were talking about in blitzscaling when you have a winner-take-all market and your competitors are raising a lot of capital. That's where you should blitzscale. And the case of Airbnb is a really good example. I happen to believe that in emerging ecosystems, few scenarios look like that. And the safer, more strategic approach is to kind of take this camel approach. And so what I observe actually like tactically and what that means from a cash flow basis for a startup, most startups have what's called a J-curve. They lose money at the beginning, investing for the future, and hopefully make more revenue and eventually profits. I've observed a J-curve that looks a little bit more modular, less of a deep J, and then an ability to control the toggles to maybe get to profitability or understand the unit economics to be able to get there more safely. And then have an opportunity and maybe you raise venture capital from someone like us, and then you get back into the thing. So it might not be one big J, but it might be a bunch of little ones along the way. And so I think that's kind of one of the ways that I've seen, particularly in times like this, where there's a lot less capital available, that a founder can think about, it's a trade-off, right? That actually might mean a little bit lower growth, but it actually means safer growth and more long-term resilient one as well. And so that's the trade-off to play, but it's one I see a lot of founders do very successfully.
You recently announced a new big idea of yours. It was not in your book originally, actually. It was last month at the TED Talk you delivered. It was titled The Great Diffusion. Tell us more about this big idea and how do you foresee the development of this concept impacting innovation and startup ecosystem going forward?
Well, and I'll be very excited to get the feedback and thoughts from folks. But the talk is called.
It's 15 minutes. We need you to summarize it in 2 or 3 minutes or 3 minutes.
The notion of the talk, it's called The Great Diffusion. The notion is that the last 150 years of technological progress brought us unprecedented economic growth, but actually had one byproduct. And the byproduct was centralization. Centralization in our factories and integrated supply chains, centralization in businesses and white-collar work, centralization in our infrastructure, et cetera. And I think that if you take a 1,000-foot view out of connecting a lot of the dots of all the startups that are in Hub 71 and all the startups kind of around the world, you say, look, there's some really interesting things happening in production, like 3D printing and autonomous robots. There's some really interesting things happening in production of energy with solar panels and batteries and water reclamation. There's some really interesting things happening in white-collar work, like remote work and virtual reality goggles and things like that. If you take all these together, I actually think we're entering an era where we might see innovation pull in a different way. And that's what the talk's about. I'm sure we can get you the link on the show notes. And I would love your feedback on it. It's kind of an idea I'm starting to write about and think about. And that's the Great Diffusion.
Okay, so we will end with the last 2 questions with some tips and advices from you. First, we need your recommendations in the context of the UAE ambitions to become a global innovation hub. How do you assess its current position, and what specific advice would you offer to initiatives like Hub 71 to enhance the local startup ecosystem, and how the UAE leverage its unique regional strength in this endeavor?
Well, I'm very excited for the UAE and Abu Dhabi, and excited to be here. A couple of thoughts, and I think one is a little bit of continue doing what you're doing. Most of the companies I've backed in the regions I feel like are increasingly coalescing around ADGM. It's really interesting to see that. I'm seeing more and more companies build their teams here, but actually with kind of a decentralized operating model where they might actually be executing a business in North Africa or in Saudi or even farther afield. And so the result of that is keep being a welcoming place to build and make it easy to build engineering teams and technology teams. Keep making it a place with very predictable governance to set up companies. I think those are the things. I think it's really hard to make an innovation hub happen overnight. And I think it's about getting the startups at the ground floor starting. And I also think it's about making sure the mid-stage companies get to exits, because that's how we end up as an ecosystem to have founders that have gone the whole distance, but also creating a generation of angel investors and mentors and the next set of folks that are going to found companies. And so it's also think about how do we scale those up, and I know that's on the big agenda as well. But in summary, I'm very excited. I think there's.
What do you think is missing from most of the entrepreneurial hotspot you have, knowledge about? You recommend that UAE should focus on?
This is going to sound trite, and I think it's time. 10 years ago, 4 cities had created Unicorn. Today, 150. Right? Like the statistics are on the right side, but we're still very early in that story. And what we haven't seen yet is the next cycle. If we take that statistic with the other one I mentioned, which is that at a certain concentration of scaled businesses, there tends to be an explosion. What you need is time. It's setting the stage, having companies get built, making sure you create a welcoming environment to keep talent there, maybe start their next business. And that's where the virtuous cycle happens. Endeavor, which is kind of an ecosystem developing organization, talks about the multiplier effect, which I really like. It's about the first big business that is connected with the next wave, that then's connected with the third generation. I think it's about time. Like that's the thing that's missing is letting a bunch of the seeds that are getting put in the ground flourish and just making sure that we're still watering them.
Knowing what you know about entrepreneurial ecosystems and hotspots, how has this influenced you as an investor? And what key insights and best practices have you gleaned from these experiences that you would share with other fellow investors?
I will say I've basically dedicated my life and my career to the notion of investing in startups outside Silicon Valley. And so if you read my book, it's essentially the investment thesis of the firm I work with and how we look at the world. Maybe I'll also have one piece of advice or one thing that I think about, which is a design principle of how we work with startups, is I don't like being a Silicon Valley investor that invests in a company in Abu Dhabi alone. Because, I've come here a lot. I lived in Dubai for a bit, but I'll never be as knowledgeable about the region as the local funds here. No chance. Same in any other geo where we invest. And so I often tell founders, and I think I would say the same thing to VCs, is, as a VC, we have a portfolio of companies that we invest in.
How many companies you have?
We'll have, our firm will have between 20 and 25. I think that founders should too. Founders should also have a portfolio of people on the cap tables, and they should have local funds, maybe they have industry funds, maybe they have corporates, and perhaps they should also have global firms as part of it. I think it's really important for, as innovation globalizes, to actually have local and global partnerships in that way and working in lockstep. And so that's kind of a design principle of how we work, but also kind of an advice of something I think ends up being pretty powerful and impactful for companies.
We'll have 5 minutes for questions from the audience. If you haven't feel satisfied about some parts of this talk, you want to clarify some stuff, or you want to maybe argue against some ideas that Alex mentioned, please raise your hand, introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. I like the concept of Camel, especially applicable in healthcare, where we can't get you successful companies in 2-3 years. How does the VC cycle funding work with Camel? You have exit in 5 years to show your LPs some reimbursement. And second thing is, if you're going to build Camels, is VC funding the right route to go down? Is it bootstrapping it or raising it from family and friends?
I think that's an awesome question. And I'll say the way I think about building a Camel is that it's first and foremost a philosophy of how you're thinking about building your business. And then there's a question of how do you fund the growth and the trade-offs you make. And I think the philosophy is one where you're saying, what are the toggles of growth that I'm going to play on? How do my unit economics look? And I think they're default strong and positive, not growth at any cost. It's a managed burn. I think that's at the core is kind of the philosophy. And then there's a question of, well, how fast should I grow? And what should I do? And obviously I'm a VC. I would be out of business if there were no startups to fund. I think it's a land of trade-offs. And I think the trade-off is you could grow slower, because I think that's often what it means, but entirely organically and have a little bit longer term playbook, or for specific opportunities, like, hey, I want to expand to this other market, or we're going to accelerate this other product, or whatever. That can be accelerated with venture. So I don't think the two are mutually exclusive, but I actually think it takes a little bit of a lens. I don't think that's for every VC fund either. So it also takes kind of VC funds to think about it and have that view on it.
But two questions. The one would be, which stage do you mainly focus in for your investments? And the second, which vertical or industry do you mainly focus on when you're looking at the global market?
A couple of things. I started investing in financial services. What got me interested in venture from the get-go was the power. I was observing the power of M-Pesa connecting folks in East Africa, and Mohammed Yunus with microfinance, et cetera, but business model innovation to radically increase access. And that got me excited in innovation. That's kind of how I landed in fintech investing, and then it's kind of expanded from there. I actually think some of the same dynamics that happened 10 years ago in financial services, financial inclusion, are actually now a couple years into the digital inclusion, health inclusion. So that is one of the reasons I'm spending time on it.
And then on a personal question, what do you think has been the most successful, best startup you've invested in?
Oh man, it's hard to say what is your favorite investment or whatever.
Favorite baby.
I think it's really tough. But let me tell you about one company that I think is a nice example of what we're thinking about as a firm, and I think is a nice example of the power of technology with the mission we're looking at. I was an early investor in a company called Zen Business in the US. And what Zen Business does is company formation. So they form your LLC or S Corp or C Corp or whatever. But because they know where you live and what you do and what your business does and what your social security number is, with one click they can open a bank account, send your first invoice, buy a domain, pre-populate it, essentially become a single pane of glass for a small business. Imagine Stripe Atlas and startups, but for HVAC professionals and doctors or whatever. I think it's a tool for very small businesses to rent the scale of more medium-sized businesses. We're seeing that business model play out. So one of the reasons I'm excited about it is not just because I think it gives entrepreneurial chance to a much wider set of folks beyond kind of the startup community, but also is one that I think is potentially very applicable in a bunch of other regions, and we're excited to be looking at it.
So what about, like, do you abandon your investments? Do you double down? So when do you jump the ship?
Well, hopefully not jump the ship. Look, I think this is a question that every VC fund model looks different. My philosophy is if we're picking companies in these global categories, which is a really big part of our strategy, we like to be partnering over the long term and taking that long-term view, especially given just the camel notion that I described. So we tend to be long-term holders, but I actually really believe that VCs should be specialists at specific stages as well. In the sense that I think that building a startup is actually, it's not getting to company stage at the beginning, it's actually solving a specific set of incremental problems. And the beginning is, can the team work together? Can the team build a product? Do people want the product? And can you get product market fit? Can you sell the product? And can you do that repeatedly, like scaling fit? And then can you build an organization to do that at scale? Those are very different kind of questions. And we tend to invest in seed and A. I like the set of questions like, can you get product market fit? Can you start building repeatability? Like, I think that's where we try to help, and we try to help founders with that focus. But my specialty is not kind of organization building and kind of what you might do at Series C and D. And so I actually think VC funds should focus or have an opportunity, especially smaller firms, to be really focused at a particular stage.
Thank you, Alex Lazarow, venture capitalist and author of Out, Innovate. Thank you so much for our audience as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.